Chapter 7, Human Population and the Environment. So after having gone through chapters 1 through 4 consecutively, we're going to start skipping around a little bit. I will address chapter 5 a little bit later on in the semester, but next we're going to actually jump up to chapter 7, starting to talk about human population. So the things we've looked at so far, discussing just in general what environmental science is and what our goals are, looking at these concepts of sustainability, giving you a little background in history into the environmental movement and some important pieces of environmental legislation, and then also some of the health problems that have come from the different types of environmental problems we see. Next, we're going to talk about this concept of human population and how the number of people on this planet are sort of exacerbating all of the different types of problems that we're going to address from this point on. So once we're finished discussing human population, then we're going to move on to talking about air pollution and water pollution and ground pollution and global warming and all of the different, per se, environmental problems that we're facing. And at each point, we will discuss how a growing human population is making all of these problems that much worse, if you will. So let's learn about the growing human population, why it's growing, and what we can do to possibly curb that growth. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about, in this lecture highlight, I'm going to talk about population ecology. We're going to go through some basic demographics, and we're going to talk about stabilizing world population numbers and also where people are living. So let's start first with a really basic discussion of what a population is. And regardless of whether we're talking about people or plants or bacteria or animals or anything in between, a population is simply individuals of the same species that live in the same place at the same time. You can be as big or small with your population as you want. You can talk about the population of a town or a village, a state, an entire country, the world, whatever you want to define it as. There's a whole field of biology that is dedicated to studying how populations respond to the environment. It's called population ecology. And what population ecologists do is they look at how populations' numbers change in response to food availability, resources, predation, diseases, those types of things. So again, regardless of whether you're talking about the population of wildflowers or a population of animals, populations have characteristics that are the same. They grow. And how do they grow? Well, we have to look at two major factors, birth rate and death rate. Quite simply, if the population is growing, then the birth rate is going to be greater than the death rate, and our R, which is our growth rate, is going to be greater than 0. That makes sense. The more individuals being born, the fewer individuals dying, it means your population is growing. If the population is shrinking, then R is less than 0. It means there's more individuals dying in a population than being born. And if the population is stable, they're both approximately the same. Growth rate is also affected by something called dispersal, so people moving to one area or leaving an area. This is more of a factor for human populations than it is for populations of other individuals. But you can basically look at it as, the population of a country is not just the numbers of births and deaths, but also the amount of people coming into the country and the amount of people leaving the country. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about the difference between two different types of growth rates, how populations can grow. The first one we're going to talk about is something called exponential growth, and it sounds like just what it is. It's when a population continues to grow without any abandon or reason. So it's just growing, continuously upward. We look at the shape of that growth curve and we call it a J-shaped curve. And just what it means is this population is doubling very, very quickly, and it continues to grow on and on and on and on and upward. Bacteria are the ideal organisms to look at exponential growth. However, in reality, you cannot grow exponentially forever. Remember that I mentioned that all living things need to meet their basic needs. You need food, water, shelter, and space. And you have to compete for those resources. So the environment will limit exponential growth. You cannot grow exponentially forever. You'll run out of food. You will run out of water. You'll run out of shelter. All of those different things. So what happens is we say that the environment actually controls population size, and what happens is there's a resistance. That resistance is referred to as the carrying capacity. So our next big point in this lecture is carrying capacities. What's a carrying capacity? Basically, it is the largest population that a particular environment can support sustainably. Sustainably means long term. So this is as many bears as can live in this forest, or this is as many rabbits that can live in this meadow, whatever it happens to be. What this type of growth looks like is, rather than a J-shaped growth curve, we call this an S-shaped curve, and we call it logistic growth and not exponential growth. So you can see the population starts out growing really, really quickly, but then we're going to reach this limit, this carrying capacity that says, whoa, we can't stop growing like this. We have to level off. And at this point, the population growth rate approaches 0. So let's take a look at humans. So far throughout our history, you can see we have basically a classic J-shaped curve, which means we are an exponentially growing population. How much further do we have to go? Well, there's lots of estimates. On the low end, maybe a little over 7 million, which we're going to blow right by that. A medium estimate says maybe 9 million by 2050, and then the high estimate says, no, we'll be up at 10 billion by 2050. Why is this important? Well, because the Earth has a carrying capacity. There's only so many of us humans that can run around this planet. We're going to run out of food, water, shelter, and space. So the idea is well, what's going to happen when we reach our carrying capacity, whatever it happens to be? Well, the optimists say birth rates will gradually decrease, populations will stabilize, and we'll be okay. Pessimists say that there will be too many humans, we're going to make the Earth uninhabitable for ourselves and others, and there's going to be a lot of suffering and death. Let's hope it's the former and not the latter. Some people think we've already surpassed our carrying capacity. Some people think that we are well on our way to the second option and not the first option. But hopefully there are things that we can do to slow those rates. So this is just showing you briefly where people are situated. Densely populated areas, okay, places like India and China, the United States, Indonesia, Japan, certain parts of Europe. Those are places where most people live. So next big topic I want to bring up is talking basically about a little bit about demographics. Demographics is a branch of not biology, it's actually sociology, and it deals with where people basically live and how they live. We talk about statistics. We can group countries by growth rates. We can group them by how industrialized they are, how prosperous they are. There's lots of different ways that we can group countries. The first way we're going to talk about is the most populous countries in the world. You should know that China and India are the most populous. They have over 1 billion people each. United States, we have about 330-ish million people, 34 I think we're up to, and then other countries that top the 100 million mark as well. Highly developed countries, places like the United States and Canada and parts of Europe and Australia, we are defined by the fact that we have low birth rates, low infant mortality rates, long life expectancies, and we have a lot of prosperity, which means we have higher more money and more resources to go around, basically. Moderately developed countries have higher birth and infant mortality rates, a medium amount of industrialization, and lower prosperities. And then those less developed countries are the places that have the shortest life expectancies and the highest birth and infant mortality rates. So we can tell a lot about a country just looking at how babies are born and what their chances are of actually surviving past infancy. That can tell you a lot about the demographics of a country. Looking at this idea of trying to slow population growth, we have to talk about our next big point here, which is looking at fertility rates. In a perfect world, if we wanted to essentially keep the population stable as it is, not have any more or any less people on this planet going forward, we would need to achieve what's called replacement level fertility, okay, which means just enough people to replace ourselves. And it tends to be 2.1 children per woman. And you say, okay, well, why 0.1 of a child? That accounts for any type of infant mortality. So you can't always assume that every child is born is going to actually survive. So that 0.1 actually accounts for those individuals. The total fertility rate right now worldwide is about 2.6 children per woman. And I know that doesn't seem like it's very different, but that 0.5 difference actually makes a really big difference in a growing global population. Fertility rates have declined over time. If you compare the 1960s to the last 10 years or so, for most countries, you can see dramatic decreases in fertility rates. And that's related to, again, this idea of the more prosperous a country comes, the more education, the more money, the fewer children women tend to have. And not only do we see in these highly developed countries fewer children being born, we also have longer lifespans. And so you see more elderly people in these types of countries. So what can we do to reduce population rates? This is our next big point, is we have to look at the role of women. It all comes down to women. No offense, guys, it's not that you're not important, but in this discussion, we're talking about the status of women. Cultural traditions, social and economic status of women, whether or not there's family planning services, and government policies. So culture and fertility, very simply, different cultures have different ideas of how many children a woman should have. In some cultures, it's 1. In some cultures, it's 10. In some cultures, it's, I don't care how many girls there are, just as long as we have, at least a few boys. So that plays a large role in how many children we have, is how are girls valued versus how are boys valued. We also have to look at the gender status of women. In most countries, it's a lower status. They're typically poor, they typically don't have any education, and they typically aren't as valued as men. So one of the greatest things we can do to help with fertility rates is to actually give women an education. Because when women have an education, they marry later, they have fewer children, it increases the time between generations, children are typically healthier, and they have more control over their fertility. The next important point for women is having family planning services. So you can't reduce your fertility if you don't have access to preventative health care. So prenatal care, spacing between births, access to birth control, those types of things are all important in controlling fertility as well. And then also government policies. So if we have a minimum age to marry, if we have a minimum amount of education that children must have, if we have budgets for family planning services and things like this, all of these things can go a long way into reducing total fertility rates, which is the only way we're going to be able to control a growing human population. The governments at least 78 countries have recognized that they must limit population growth. This is a necessity, a need. Our last point really quickly is looking at urbanization. Okay, cities have certain characteristics. They tend to be younger, people looking for work. What we see is that more and more people are moving to urban areas and moving out of rural areas, and it causes problems. It causes problems in the sense that we have old factories to contend with, we have commuting, lots of pollution, high density areas, a lot of water flow. So cities have problems, but there's also benefits to urbanization because we can build in one area and we can leave more green space outside of it. So 50% of the world's population live in urban areas. In highly developed countries, that's about 75%, and it's increasing rapidly in developing countries. We have megacities where more than 10 million people have. We even have areas in Tokyo where there's over 50 million people. So this chart actually looks at, you can see how over time, rural populations and urban populations, we have increasing urban populations and decreasing rural populations, more and more people moving to cities. In highly developed countries, it was a slow process. It was okay because we could keep up with all of the extra services we need. The problem is developing countries. These countries cannot provide basic services to all the people that are moving in to urban areas. There's better job possibilities than out in rural areas, but you still have a variety of things to contend with. That's it for this chapter. Please make sure you review the rest of the notes before continuing on.